Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I am the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington, along with our friends Community Bookstore in Brooklyn and Exile in Bookville in Chicago. We are very happy to have with us tonight Jessi Jezewska Stevens discussing her new novel, The Visitors, with Joshua Cohen, author most recently of The Netanyahus. First of all, I do want to invite you all to use the chat window at the bottom of your screen. Let us know where you're calling in from. And while you're doing that, I just want to say that one of the true silver linings of the pandemic is being able to work with bookstores all across the country to put on virtual events like the one you'll be seeing tonight. Third Place Books is happy to be joined by Community Bookstore and Exile and Bookville. And we're also thankful to And Other Stories, Jessi's publisher, for their adamant, if not wholesomely aggressive support of independent book selling in both the UK and the United States. So I've been waiting this conversation for a very long time, and we're happy to have it tonight. All three of the stores hosting today have author events all year round, both in person and online. And actually on August 9th, Third Place Books is working again with Community Bookstore and a number of other stores to present a virtual conversation between Jessi Ball and Max Porter for Jessi's new memoir, Auto Portrait. Summer tends to be slow for events, but you should sign up for our email newsletters to be the first to know what we're going to be up to this fall. So watch out for that link in the chat during the event. As mentioned, the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open, and we encourage you to use it respectfully. During the last 15 minutes or so, we'll also have time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors this evening, please submit those to the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. We also offer closed captioning for anyone who's interested. You can just hit the live transcript button to turn that feature on or off. A reminder that this event will be recorded, so if you miss anything, we'll be emailing that recording to anyone who registered. And of course, you can order The Visitors from Third Place Books, Community Bookstore, and Exile and Bookville, or just drop by your local bookstore. Bookstores events like this one are intentionally free and intentionally open to the public. Every book or every purchase you make supports the future of these author series. So thank you. And now, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Jessi Jezewska Stevens is the author of The Exhibition of Persephone Q, a really good novel about identity in the digital age that I personally recommend. Her stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The Nation, New York Times, and Foreign Policy. Before receiving her MFA from Columbia, she studied mathematics, and she is also the author of a Sharp Substack newsletter about politics, literary criticism, and some well-articulated gripes and culture. This morning, I saw in my inbox that Jessi's latest piece is on the new novel by Tessa Moshfegh, Lapvona, and Pure Color by Sheila Heti, and I can't wait to read it. Joining Jessi in conversation is Joshua Cohen, whose many books include Moving Kings, Book of Numbers, Wits, A Heaven of Others, and Cadenza for the Schneiderman Violin Concerto. He's also the author of the story collection Four New Messages and the essays Attention, Dispatches from a Land of Distraction. Cohen was awarded Israel's 2013 Matinel Prize for Jewish Writers, and in 2017 was named one of Granta's best young American novelists. This year, he received the National Jewish Book Award for Fiction and the Pulitzer Prize for The Netanyahus, the subtitle of which is An Account of a Minor and Ultimately Even Negligible Episode in the History of a Very Famous Family, published by New York Review Books. Maybe I should have led with that, but I wanted to keep you all in suspense. This afternoon, Jessi and Josh are both talking about The Visitors. It's a unique and strange novel about the internet, systems collapse, debt and finance, love, and a hallucinated gnome preoccupied by the electrical grid. Andrew Martin, author of Early Work, writes that The Visitors is caustic, intimate, and consistently surprising. This novel cements Stevens' place as one of the great chroniclers of our cruel and terrifying times. We're so pleased to bring you these two to your screen tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jessi Jezewska Stevens and Joshua Cohen.
Hello, pausing for applause here. Thank you very much to all the bookstores and all the people watching. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks for doing this, Josh.
And thanks to Triple Canopy, who are not just, masters of hand lettering and tape, but an essential web magazine of art and culture. We are coming to you live from their studios in post-pandemic downtown New York on Canal Street, and where it's too hot to transmit anything. I think we'll just there are some things that I want to kind of start slow with some things, which is kind of unlike me. You know, I don't want to, you know, and so I think we should really begin with Jessi kind of reading from this book so you can get a little bit of the tone. I'll just say, because now it'll be the second sort of plot summary after the first. I'll try to bring people where they need to go, and then you'll take them really where they need to go before you read. I mean, this is a really a beautiful, but a really also painful and a book, because how else could you really be if you're intelligent in this world, which is, you know, besides in pain, and a deeply intelligent book about a person who has maybe been pushed or frustrated beyond their ability to withstand the forces at work. I mean, and a person who, I'm talking about C, who is the protagonist. I'm telling you this in case you don't know, right? Who has the I think very common fate of understanding. Actually, you know, maybe it's not as common as we think, but she understands the forces and the systems arrayed against her. But that understanding and that intellect is no defense. She finds herself as the proprietor of a art supply store, you know, so she, in her own tiny way, controls the means of production, but only at a secondary level. And as that store falls more and more into debt, she sort of falls farther and farther from being in control of her life and from being able to see a path forward for her ambitions. And at some point, this maybe self-perceived failure, or this frustration, or maybe it's magic, becomes personified in a gnome on loan from Travelocity, I think, right? Who begins giving her some very convincing but maybe bad advice. Yeah, this is I think that's the dyad that in my mind really comprises the flesh of the book. She of course has a fraught relationship with a friend, hers called Zoe, and relationships with teachers and with colleagues and with banks.
Yeah, most of the trouble is with the banks.
Yeah.
And so I think that brings up, thank you, Josh. I think that brings us right to the passage that I want to read over the course of the novel, the arc of C's decline with her craft store that is in debt, with her relationships. She has become closer to this visitor that she has, this gnome-like visitor who's giving her, sort of egging her on towards systems collapse. And when we meet her here in this passage, towards the end of the novel, all you need to know is that she's walking down the west side of Manhattan, and her goal is to reach Zuccotti Park, where Occupy is ongoing. So I'm just going to read for a few minutes and then we'll discuss a little bit more. She walks. Over 6 miles, her phone accrues 6 messages. From the bank, from the landlord, from Fran, from parents wondering why class was canceled again and demanding refunds. Then it dies. Now she is part of the vaudevillian display. There is nothing left to do but perform. It is an act of generosity to break the monotony, to cleave a day into 2 acts that may be compared. All one needs in order to feel is juxtaposition, to fold a life along the perforated line of an event horizon. C accepts this calling. She is calm. The old trees sway overhead. She is warm inside her coat, the lining sticking to her dewy skin. The bra straps slide down her shoulders and are not corrected. She is so warm, hot. She undoes the buttons, the scarf, revels in the cold. "Hello, gnome," she says aloud. He is bobbing at her side, though it's a shame she can't quite see him. She wonders if he's cold. What is there to teach? This is an age for the monologue, for wisdom gotten cheap, the flimsy forms of people speaking nonsense. There's not so much in one's control, not much to do but crouch at the loom of one's own life and draw the shuttle through the preloaded pattern of the warp. What you see is what you get, and what you see is all there is. The challenge is to think in threads, never see the whole. Don't look up. Every creation fails its original conception, especially when everyone already knows what you're going to become. They've been watching, anticipating. Foliage falls through the air. The sun transforms leaves to licks of flame, and the wreckage lands at C's feet. She wades, climbs a hill through the brush, over a low wall, meets cement. Buildings rise and compress the world. In Midtown, she steps into a department store. No one kicks her out. She moves through the slick glitter of the cosmetic counters in her bra and trench, chest bare, coat open, her belly soft and vulnerable. At a mirror, she draws a knob of lipstick across her lips, sinks a sample brush into a tube of mascara, and adorns her lashes. The perfumes are an enchantment. They have such immaterial names: allure, temptation, ecstasy. A saleswoman shoos her away. The gnome has learned a great deal about life in the months he's trailed C. He understands the toaster, the dryer, the dangers of inserting a fork into the toaster to extract a slice of bread, and also recklessness. C fishes daily for her toast with forks. He understands the shower. Sometimes hot means hot, and other times cold. He is familiar with the origin of the universe as seen from a human perspective. Nothing, nothing, then language, then the world. He has studied how little humans understand themselves, how incapable they are of thinking ahead, how fragile the architecture of the human mind is, riddled by rivers of desire whose currents always shift. Consume, consume. There is no static equilibrium of preference. If only they could abstain from activities that cause them harm. But apparently, he knows this too. There is some pleasure in the pain. He has seen children build their block towers only to topple them. Towers, he's concluded, are built to be smashed. He understands C's intentions as she traipses down 6th Ave, gnawing a candy bar. And by logical extension, he must approve of the plan. So I'll stop there.
Right. By logical extension, he must approve of the plan. Yeah, that's not logical at all. But and I think that's a part of the great trick of this book and of your previous novel. And so when I said that I wanted to start slow, you know, you had a novel come out. I can't remember time anymore, but it was sometime, you know, not that long ago. And it was your first novel.
Right at the beginning of the pandemic.
Well, right. and it's also a book where a woman walks a lot in the city, right? And it's a story really of a woman who, Percy, the book is called The Exhibition of Persephone Q, but Percy receives an anonymous envelope with a catalog enclosed in it that has photographs of her naked on a bed that were taken, you know, in X for a show that was supposed to make its opening on September 12th 2001. And one of the complicating of the many complicating gestures in this book is that, you know, we sort of begin with this idea, or we're introduced to this idea, and then there is doubt that sets in, right? There is that really me in those photographs? Do I remember them being taken? Why don't I remember them being taken? Why does a life in which those photographs would have been taken not in some way correspond to my life now? And the life of the protagonist now is recently married and newly pregnant. And so and this book, in a very, very kind of basic way, seems the opposite, right? And I think that's fascinating. I think that, you know, look, these books come out, no one pays attention, a few people care, and then you wake up one day and you have a career and you've written things, right? But I think that, you know, you've written so much and you've written so well that to look back at this last book, and along with some other stories you've written, but really this last book, and then look at this book, you have a person who almost begins with certainty, and because of maybe her status, who she is then pushed into doubt. And you have this C in the visitors who encounters what to my mind would be an even crazier situation, which is a gnome shows up at her house and starts, you know, speaking like, you know, like very high level Don DeLillo at her, right? And and she accedes to the fantasy, right? I mean, she there are times where she kind of pushes it away, but this is the story of her coming closer to identification with its truth. And I wanted to ask you which direction you're going in.
Yeah.
It's a long question, but it's a good one.
I mean, I think it's right to say that there's something that I think it's right to note the sense of reversal here, because Percy, in a way, creates or projects her sort of fantasy. And I think another part of that book is in her own doubt, there's this added tension of whether we as readers believe her. Do we, how are we responding to her narrative of herself? There, it is called the Exhibition of Persephone Q. We get her sort of life story as a frame novella in the center. And there's this, this tension of who invents whom, and whose narrative do we believe in inventing ourselves in the country of individualisms and self-invention. And I think it's true that here in the visitors, we start in a place of certainty insofar as C believes that she has played by the rules, that she has learned the rules of the system that she's in, failing only to notice that our economic and political systems in America feel very much set up to allow you to fail and then tell you that it's your fault in a way. And so I think that when things start to fall apart, she continues to try to play by the rules. She tries to refinance, she tries to pay back her loans, and it doesn't work because in a way it wasn't meant to work. But I think that sense of doubt and that sense of the rules of the world that I thought I was in, the rules that relate to how I view my place in the world, my relationship to other people, my place in society, that sense that they suddenly float away from you or are being rewritten, and you no longer feel the freedom or the control to write those rules yourself. I think that is a connection in both books, and I think it speaks to the kind of gaslighting moment that we are in, in living in this moment of late capitalism. I think that feeling of the rules of the world that you think you occupy being sort of rewritten or drifting out of your control is that sense of doubt and confusion and anxiety and almost a surreal quality of the texture of reality changing that is present in both of these books.
So, I mean, I think this is, you know, it's a major subject of the book. it's a major subject of fiction of the last 50 years. And it's probably, to my mind, the major spiritual subject of anyone alive right now is what the fuck is a system, and why did we believe that it ever existed? Mm-hmm. Right? The idea that like that there are rules, and that and that the rules are either made by common consent or by some tradition that implies or has taken into account fairness, right? And also that these systems function, algorithmically or mathematically. It's like where they always get the same result, the same output comes from the same input, right? It seems to me to have always been that any student of history would think that this is just, a fairy tale. And, and appropriately, these books both incorporate a lot of myth and fairy tale. How do you see a relationship between this belief in systems and this reliance on systemic thinking for one's like survival, maybe, and so-called, the systems novel, and a novel that proceeds by an interest in these systems and also along some of the same paths?
Well, I think that belief in systems and belief in myth or fairy tales are highly connected in our need to believe in something. And I think there are a lot of narratologists who would actually say that the rationalization of our lives, when we say, well, we live rationally now, this is the value that the market has assigned this thing. When we believe in these sorts of systems, that this is actually in some ways a way of displacing the kinds of more mythical ways of viewing the world. So I think that this is very connected. I mean, it's interesting that you bring up certainty too, because I think that in a way, I mean, we use this language, the financial crisis is a big part of the book. This is in some ways an alternative history of Occupy. It takes place in 2011, but through Zoe, a close childhood friend and love interest of C's. She's a trader on Wall Street, and through her, we get a sort of firsthand account of the financial crisis.
And can I just interject for 1 second?
Yeah.
And a large part of it is it brings Occupy onto the internet in a way that Occupy wasn't.
Yes. Well, we have an alternative. Right, we have an alternative eco-hacktivist group called Goodnight that is sort of moving the goalposts a little bit in this alternative history to a more extreme total system collapse. They are trying to take down the entire national grid, to sort of ground zero. And when we talk about the financial crisis, though, today, and a lot of the critiques that we bring to that moment, we actually use the kind of language of delusion or myth, right? Because at the center of something like the financial crisis was the idea that we can be absolutely certain in the models that we have. We can be absolutely certain that they accurately represent the underlying referent of what things are valued, of our model of what's going on in the economy is an accurate representation of the underlying reality, and it absolutely wasn't. And that kind of overconfidence in the models really lies, to me, at the heart of the financial crisis. In terms of the connection between these systems then and novels and systems novels. I think the novelist always understands that if the novel is a model of some kind of reality, there isn't that same insistence of, well, there is certainty here, right? This is the value of things because the market says it is. I think that the novel is a more ambiguous and questioning space.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking of the systems novel in a Tom LeClaire definition of a novel that doesn't proceed uh, uh, by way of relationships between or among characters, but a novel that proceeds, by way of relationships between and among symbols, institutions, modes of writing, and one of the things that really strikes me, when reading again both these books. I mean, the last one, which has a an air of classical antiquity about it, with all of its Persephone references and its Helen references, and this one, which has a, you'll forgive me, Norse, I don't know, like a Middle Earth flavor, because of its, you have some, trolls coming out from the, from the underworld or something. There is there's a sense that I have, though, of a different definition of a system, right? The systems that we've all been talking about seem to be some sort of like utopian or just like mathematically like autistic version of democracy, where we can elect these rules, and then if we follow them, we can survive, right? As opposed to the systems of control that predate it, which is that if the king decides, or if the gods come down and decide to fuck up your life, that's the system, and you can't do anything about it. And so what's fascinating to me about both of these books is that like they have protagonists who sort of have beliefs in these systems, whether that system is a system of marriage and childbearing, in the previous novel, whether this one is just, I can run a small business in America and support artists, right? And then something other happens. And it's not enough to say that it's a projection of their minds. And it's also not enough to say it's just magic. It's it may be the closest thing that's sufficient is to say, do you believe in magic? Or to answer that question.
I do believe that there are moments in our lives that feel uncanny or haunted or carved out some way from kind of a consensus rational reality that really only the novel can capture in some ways, and those sort of and that kind of atmosphere. I mean, one thing that I as an example, when I was a kid, I had all these surgeries. I got in this accident, and I wouldn't always know when I was going into surgery. And then I would wake up not having known that I had had surgery, not having known that I was, coming out of anesthesia, and I'd be in the children's hospital, and they'd have all these murals around, and it would just be like sea creatures, like moving, and I had no idea. And I can of course rationalize that now, but that moment existed, and it was real in that moment. And of course we can rationalize it. But I think that there are these inexplicable experiences, these heightened experiences that also that the novel can still capture and express, and that are not unrelated sometimes to those moments, as you say, when you have that awareness that you exist in a kind of system that isn't quite what you thought it was. Or if you're someone like C and you thought that you could sort of play by the status quo rules, and suddenly it turns out that you can't, then that sort of uncanny rewriting of the reality that you were in is a when we look at it, from our view, a kind of magical seeming experience. And I am interested in capturing those moments, and I do think that it's one of the things that that the novel can still do.
So, getting to what the novel can still do, let's talk about the most pitiless system that none of us chose, that none of us or that I object to every day, and that oppresses me far more than any other system I've come in contact with, which is language.
Yeah.
Right. And so from my own totally biased and personal position, it seems like I kind of I first encountered contemporary literature that was contemporary with, me being able to read it, right? Um, at the very tail end of a process that had been going on since modernism, which was, you take the trash language that the world has and you make fun of it, basically, or you repurpose it, you juxtapose it, you use it in ways against itself, and you can call it, parody or satire or détournement, or you can call it whatever you want. But it was that impulse of like, okay, the world is shouting this trash in my ear, and I'm going to give it back to them. And and that seemed to suffice for writers from, Andrei Platonov to the American postmodernists, and which is a large swath of history, right? And then it seemed that there was this change where suddenly people began, or many novelists began, speaking in the languages of ideologies and of politics. And it was about being able to frame that language in a way that sort of created a picture of the world either you wanted to depict or the world you wanted to live in, but it was not necessarily scorning general usage. Mm-hmm. This to me is the choice between those two ways of being is a real choice. It's a moral choice. It's a life choice. For me, what terms do you think about this under? Yeah. Because this book really does have so much vocabulary from finance. It has so much, it takes seriously and also pokes enormous fun at, but very straight-faced fun at the pieties around it. So how do you deal with it? Do you know whether you're being serious?
I mean, I think a lot about I think the question is mostly a limits of language question and relationship.
Yeah, it's just one of those easy limits of language questions.
Right,
yeah,
right.
You could, yeah.
And so I think a lot of things here. So, I mean, if you're saying that modernism is sort of like, trash language being shouted, well, the world has been so upturned and so rewritten that we can't even use the language that we used to use in writing novels. That's one way of looking maybe at this kind of shift. In terms,
I mean, you don't think that shift happened in the 20s? I mean, that shift was, I mean, that you mean that like it's gotten so much worse since then that we even can't use, what language of the novel can't we use? That's different from the language of the novel that they couldn't use in the 20s or 30s.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I don't know if I would put boundaries on it. I think I feel a connection to that central that the central challenge of all novelists are like, what are the limits of expression and what are the limits of the language that I have available? And I think, so I want to talk about, we brought up sort of literary tradition and how, I might see myself, place myself in that. And then also, but before I bring that up, that limits of language question to me was also central to the financial crisis. And so that's why it was so interesting for me to try to write about it here. There's the idea that markets themselves are a kind of means of communication that pick up where maybe language leaves off, that the market is this incredible kind of supercomputing system that plans and organizes and communicates desires and decisions in a way that language can't even. And this is kind of a fundamental split between, do you believe in planned economies or not? And so that was really interesting to me, and the way that it maps to, the novelist problem of what are the limits of language, that it maps to the frustrations that we can feel in the 2018 political moment that I began this book up through today of, what are the limits of expression through the democratic vote right now, and if we're sort of losing that face. So I think that the limits of expression through all of the systems that are represented in the book was a very deep root. And we could even say that the housing market crashed simply because the language that was used for all of these derivatives was intentionally so opaque that people didn't understand what they were trading, and that that word had no referent in the world anymore. That was broken. And then in terms, yeah.
And it wasn't even, for in most cases, at least to my mind, it wasn't even a malevolent obfuscation. It was actually an obfuscation internal, right?
Yes. And that is also a collapse of belief, which I think is why Zoe is our sort of into the financial crisis and into the financial world. And when you can see that system of belief collapsing, it was interesting to me to frame it as a collapse of a belief system, and also as a failure of communication. In terms of that kind of literary tradition, I mean, I write psychological fiction, I write domestic fiction. We've talked a lot about systems, but there is a central relationship here between C and Zoe. These childhood friends, they grew up together. There is a romantic interest between them now, and I think that they are
Complicated romantic interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was thinking C is also a weaver, a textile artist. I was thinking about touch and even sex as these other means of communication, as a counter to some of these other systems that we have brought up. So I think that the heart of the book really is relationships, and really is it is psychological fiction, but it's also kind of domestic fiction in a way, and that we spend a lot of time one-on-one with characters in these domestic spaces. But I'm also very attracted to the kind of 20th century European modernist hysteria, and also as a reaction to history. So if it's possible to create a spectrum between kind of domestic fiction and that kind of hysterical and more ironic use of language, then I hope that spectrum exists, because I like to imagine myself on it somewhere.
I mean, so let me, just because it's just me and you, right?
There's no one else is listening.
Right. And it's not going to go online, and it doesn't matter, right?
Forever.
So and you can, I don't think I've ever said this to you.
Okay.
I don't know. You tell me, right? But like, so I read this book in a few different, iterations, and you kept on telling me that things were like really, really different, but like the heart of this book was like, it was there. But my reading of it was always, oh, wow, you found the absolute perfect way to just put into a book, to create a character of like every obnoxious male late 20th century novelist and have him basically like have a home invasion of this young female struggling small business owner who's just trying to have a craft store and is not sure whether she's a lesbian, right? And he just ruins her life. And I always read, all right, I always read the gnome as a it's like if DeLillo plus Pynchon plus a little bit of Coover, some Joe McElroy, like definitely some Gaddis, just got shrunk down, like in that Alexander Payne movie, into like a little tiny garden gnome guy, and just crashes her life in her consciousness. How wrong am I?
I mean, it's always hard to tell the origin story of the idea, right? I mean, I do think that so I know that we are both fans of the Magic Mountain, or were at one point. I continue to be a fan. And this
I went back to it and read the whole thing, and I just decided no, not anymore.
And so this was I was thinking of a few things. So the ironic distance there of the narrator in the Magic Mountain, studying these characters. The book takes place at a tuberculosis sanatorium. You almost have this, as like a doctor would study patients in a way. And then you also have these other characters who kind of exist as characters, as ideas, and exist to give voice to ideas. And I was kind of thinking about, my first book was in first person. I'm going to write in third person now. What does it mean to write in third person now versus one of my favorite novels in third? Well, what if that's updated a little bit to be the perspective of a kind of absurd algorithm that's sort of gathering data on the characters? And if we're existing in third, you're sort of surveilling characters, and so I was thinking about, well, if I'm going to kind of teach myself an experiment in working in this perspective, how do I update that for this moment? And I think that then all of these, I think that C and Zoe exist as our deeply human characters. And then I think very much that our primary visitor, the gnome, that Goodnight, this sort of eco-anarchist hacktivist group on the sidelines, that these exist as characters of ideas, that they are sort of hacking in a way.
I mean, I find that
personal story.
Right. I find that extraordinarily generous because, I mean, take our visitor, take our gnome out of the story, and what you have is a very poignant and sincere attempt of intimacy on the part of someone whose career is screwed up because of the financial crisis, and someone who's losing their business and going into debt. And then it's this postmodern systems novelist, gnome, who crashes into everything and says, why not be a terrorist? Representing certain powers and appetites. And, you could call them, gnomic, you could call them male, you could call them from the underworld, telluric or something like that. But like there is this, he is an agent of chaos.
Yes.
Right. And, but one of the interesting things in this book that I think is politically very provocative and is that there's the possibility that this was manifested by your protagonist. Right. And I think that's so how do you feel about that in real life?
About
like are there real agents of chaos in this world so much as does the projection or hallucination or fear of agents of chaos actually create worse outcomes?
Interesting. So my background is in math and economics, and a lot of the way that you would explain inflation, for example, is simply an imaginative exercise that a lot of people believe that something bad is going to happen, and it is a mass psychology kind of thing. So in a way, I guess that the answer is both, right? That I do believe that there are agents of chaos, but I also believe that the imagination is enormously powerful. I mean, there are ways that we could, and that mass psychology also is enormously powerful, and that's basically how we write the world.
I think with that, we have to go to questions. We think we have to let the world write us.
Audience questions.
Welcome back. Hey, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I do want to mention that it sounds like there are tornado sirens going off in Chicago. So if you're watching from Chicago, hope you're staying safe. Hope this is providing you some solace and comfort as you bunker down. We're starting to get questions from the audience. If you have questions for our authors, do submit those to the Q&A window, and I'm going to be reading them off on behalf of all of you. Our first question comes from Jason Curry, who writes, what relationship or connection do you see, if any, between the conventions of domestic fiction and climate fiction? I'm thinking about this because of the eco-anarchist activist group in the book.
Yeah. So I'm interested in this question, especially because I don't know if we've written the conventions of climate fiction yet. You know, I like to think of that as something in progress. And maybe that is an interest or sort of an ambition of mine insofar as here, if I want to write about, I mean, I am fascinated by our political frustrations of working through these questions in my writing, and yet I always want to keep something of what I really love about fiction, and what I love about my favorite novels is to have deeply felt psychology and central relationships. And so I think that the trick then is always to find formal ways of doing both. And I think that this is sort of what Josh was getting at earlier in, you know, how there's this systems novel that is hacked this more domestic world. I think, I wonder if the reason that this becomes a question is that, you know, it's natural. We've underestimated. I wonder if it's more about underestimating the capacities of something that we call domestic fiction, you know, which is always seen as, you know, most often written by women and of dealing with smaller or private concerns, that it doesn't unfold at large scales, that it always takes place, you know, within the confines of a relationship or a family or a home. And so maybe, you know, even maybe we're even asking these questions because we are moving from underestimating what we think of as the convention of domestic fiction, and realizing that it is far more expansive than the scale that we once assigned it.
Josh, did you have any thoughts on the relationship between domestic fiction and climate fiction, or what we've kind of seen?
I don't even know what those things are, so I trust her.
Yeah. Let's see. Jeremy Koenig asks, he says, I'd love to hear Jessi talk about C's role as an artist and her experience with the system of art valuation and art dealing.
Yeah.
The next question is going to be like financial advice. It's going to be good. It's going to be good.
I would pay off my student loans.
How much can I put in my 401k?
Yeah, we need a new sign back here. It's all free advice. So with C's, really, I came across work by Annie Albers, and really Annie Albers' writing. And I was fascinated by, I think she's a wonderful writer. And I was also very fascinated by how much of her writing about weaving mapped to ways that I think about writing. She often writes about weaving as marrying both the emotional intuition of the artist and the problem solving and analysis of the engineer. And she's constantly not code switching between these two, but constantly making this argument of how those modes of analysis and how those two types of intelligence are absolutely interwoven into the process of designing and constructing cloth. And that was and there's another essay that that Annie Albers wrote that really says, you know, material is a means of communication, right? She argues for preserving a tactile sensibility. And so there was both this recognition and this feeling of excitement and hearing her describe weaving in a way that I think about writing. And then also this way of ferreting in a belief in like, what is real? Like, can I just reach out and touch something, especially when it feels in moments of our political and economic frustration, that the systems that govern our lives are so very far out of reach, and rewriting themselves. And I think that that is one reason why, when C's early success, she sells this big tapestry, she gets a lot of attention, she's paid a lot for it. And watching that piece get subsumed into the sort of mechanics of art criticism, and watching people interpret it, and watching it be subsumed into money. I mean, the art market exploded right after the financial crisis because people needed some place to put their cash. And they started investing in art. And this is why we saw the valuation of artworks. It's correlated there. And she didn't want to be a part of it, and was kind of disgusted by it in a way. My mother is a weaver, a very talented weaver. And so I also, while I was writing this novel, had sort of a front row seat on the process as well. And I think for all of these reasons, sort of how sees artistic ambitions and her questions of artistic integrity and expression made its way into the book.
There's a very old Arabic poem that talks about weaving as the way to you tell the story, because the threads that go horizontally, right? You need to show that a person from birth to death is a consistent development, unbroken. And that there is a connection between someone's beginning and their end, but that during the course of that continuance, there are these moments that come in with the vertical threads that are these moments that that change the context or inflection of it, and that you have to sort of be open to them too, while understanding that it changes your complexion or your presentation, but that it doesn't interrupt the ultimate destiny of the thread. Yeah. And I always thought that was a very, very potent, analogy for, or metaphor for writing.
Yeah, one of the oldest metaphors for writing that we have.
Yeah. Thank you both. That was an excellent answer. We have 3 other questions that can actually kind of be summarized, I think, into the same. First, two are from Mary and Susan, who both ask, what are your favorite novels? And Paul asks, what authors influenced your work? So I think the two can probably be combined, but if you just feel like riffing on your favorite books, then that would be wonderful.
This is always the hardest question.
Because of course, then you forget everything that you've ever read. Your brain just dumps out.
Because my favorite novels sometimes is what I need in order to help me with what I am writing, and that answer can change. In terms of, I think while I was writing this book, Magic Mountain was one of my favorite novels. And in terms of influence on the book, whatever my favorite novel is, it will always have some comedy in it, right? That feels very important to me as a how else to exist in the world. So that is important. And in terms of other influences on this book, besides what I've already named, I was looking for narratives with non human characters, or these sort of relationships with more supernatural visitors. And so Helen Oyeyemi's The Icarus Girl was a really wonderful example of this. I read some John Wyndham, a science fiction writer, who had some nice examples of this as well. So I think when you're writing a novel, I guess you could say it ruins reading, because you're always reading in a way of how is this made? How do I do that? But I guess I can't remember now reading in any other way. So.
And then we have just one more question to close out the night. An anonymous attendee asks, what is the best advice that Josh gave Jessi while reading iterations of the novel? And also, what was the worst advice?
I'm trying. I remember that we described it as a new spidery way of writing, which was kind of like, how does the book work? Not quite sure, but we think it does. Because it does capture so much. I mean, we've mentioned that it's working on this level of kind of a central relationship and a personal story, and also on a systems level. And I'm not sure if it's advice, but I guess we had one iteration of the debate of what modern technology the gnome maps to best, which I did. Which I did. I did another event with another critic who had brought up a phone. I have brought up Wikipedia. I think you have brought up Alexa.
I just think it's like the little Alexa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think. Okay, I'm going to answer this question.
Okay. Yeah.
My best advice I gave her is the book's done, stop writing it. And then the worst advice I gave is the book's done, stop writing it. Which is always the best and worst advice you can give anyone. Because the book's done.
Oh, Josh, I think your mic just muted. I can't hear you anymore.
You can translate. Okay. I said, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I said that the best advice I gave was that the book is finished and stop rewriting it. And the worst advice I gave is that the book is done and stop rewriting it. And that's always the best and worst advice you can give to anyone.
Solid.
But because only a writer can decide when their own book is finished. And I'm so glad that this is finished and this is out in the world for people to read.
Thank you.
I think that's a great place to end tonight. Thank you so much, Jessi, and thank you so much, Josh. This was a really wonderful conversation. I'm just going to remind you all to go out and pick up your copy of The Visitors from your local independent bookstore. Special thank you to, of course, Community Bookstore and Exile and Bookville, and other stories who ferry so much wonderful literature into the world, both in the US and the UK. So please go out tonight, be well. Thank you to Triple Canopy for hosting the venue. Their website is canopy.com, I believe. You should go check out that magazine. They publish some great work. Other than that, please be well and go read some good books.
Thanks so much, Spencer.